Hi, I'm Etta Spencer, and I'm going to speak today with some friends of mine who are in Waterloo or Kitchener or someplace in that part of the world. They're involved with Projects Ploughshares, which is a wonderful organization that mainly tracks the sale and trade in conventional weapons around the world. And they're particularly, of course, interested in Canada's sale of weapons. So, because this is a time when there are some wars going on where it looks like Canadian equipment, military equipment, is being used to repress people in a war zone, it's really important for us to talk to people who know something about this. So, my friend Cesar Jaramillo is the director of uh, Project Ploughshares, and Kelsey Gallagher is a newcomer to the organization. He's only been there a couple of years, and I've only now got acquainted with him. But his particular beat, as we in journalism would put it, is to track Canada's conventional weapons. Not that Canada has any weapons of mass destruction, as far as I know. At least I hope not. But you have plenty to do to keep your hands full with just looking at things like armored personnel carriers and so on, I guess. Right. So, hello, Cesar.
Hello, Meta. Thank you for having us. Always a pleasure to talk to you in
And
person or virtually.
yeah.
Thank you, Meta. Yeah, it's great to be here and great to meet you.
Okay. Let's get down to work. I want to know what's been going on. And I would say Cesar is our most, I think you're in charge of harassing the Canadian government on behalf of the rest of us. Because more than anybody else I know, you're in the newspaper as having complained about Canada selling equipment, military hardware, and so on to countries like Saudi Arabia and maybe to Turkey, right? So, and Kelsey, you specialize in keeping track of those sales. You actually know where these things are bought and purchased and created and sent,
and how they are used, which is a crucial part of the puzzle.
Okay.
Correct. Yeah.
So where do we go from here? Cesar, why don't I think you can maybe start by telling us what you complain of when you get in touch with people in Ottawa and with the press, because you have good contacts to make these infractions known. And then I think we'll get Kelsey to fill in some of the details about where these things are created and what exactly we're selling and how much money is involved. That kind of thing. Okay, pretend I'm the Prime Minister, Cesar, and you can tell me what's on your mind.
The right honorable Meta Spencer.
Right.
Yes, no. So lots on our mind, but the first thing I would start, by saying is that this isn't a matter of wishful thinking or of peaceniks, if you will. This notion that Canada shouldn't be selling to Saudi Arabia because it's not nice or because it doesn't align with the expectations I have of Canada, or it doesn't align with certain values, or certainly not with certain lefty values, whatever that means. This is a conversation about compliance with the law. And I think that coming at it from that perspective, it should matter little if you're from civil society, if you're from academia, if you're in industry, if you're in the government. I think the starting point of this conversation is compliance with the law, domestic and international law. At Project Ploughshares, we place a high premium on norms and on compliance with the norms. We feel that they should be worth something, they should count for something, that if Canada signs on to a certain commitment, it should mean something, and that there should be really a willingness to comply with whatever provisions or obligations any instrument Canada signs on to.
What has Canada committed to? We know that Canada is now a signatory of the Arms Trade Treaty.
Indeed.
But presumably you're saying that even before the international treaty was signed, there was already legislation inside Canada saying what we should be selling arms to, or what we're allowed to.
Yes, that is correct.
So make that distinction, if you will, between the international treaty and the domestic legislation.
Absolutely. Before Canada joined the Arms Trade Treaty just over a year ago, Canadian arms exports did not operate in a vacuum. There was already legislation that Canada, for many years, has referred to as some of the strongest export controls in the world. Then Canada, after a conspicuous absence from the Arms Trade Treaty, because it was a latecomer to the Arms Trade Treaty under the Harper government, there was no appetite to join. We were pushing, etc. And the Trudeau Liberals made a campaign promise that they would join the Arms Trade Treaty if they came to power. And to be fair and factual, they complied with that. They followed up with that campaign promise and joined the Arms Trade Treaty. So the Arms Trade Treaty simply adds another layer of obligations to those that were already there. Taking on the whole, domestic and international, I think that it is important to recognize that the basic formulation or the basic parameters around the arms trade don't require a lot of expertise or specialization to be understood. You know, it's a very simple formulation. You know, for states that wish to be responsible responsible actors in the international arena, even if they are arms manufacturers. So the formulation is very simple. If there is a risk of misuse, you don't export. That is really the formulation. You know, you export.
What is misuse?
It can mean various things. It can mean, and we can talk about, and Kelsey has some concrete examples about instances where Canadian weapons are supposed to go to a certain place, but are spotted elsewhere. They're supposed to go to a certain actor, but are spotted in somebody else's hands. They are supposed to be for protection, and they are spotted repressing civilians. They are supposed to be for transportation, and they are mounted with heavy artillery and used for offensive operations. So these are all instances of misuse. That was not the intended use for which they were exported. I should clarify, Project Ploughshares, we don't have a blanket opposition to the idea of the arms trade. You know, we are not pacifists in that way. There are such groups and there are such individuals, you know, that really call for a categorical halt to all arms dealing around the world. That is not us. We think, and the Arms Trade Treaty's premise is that you should avoid illegal, unscrupulous, and irresponsible arms dealing. But that still leaves a space for licit arms dealing. And if Canada is selling arms, you know, to the police department of Oslo, Norway, what have you, where there is a relatively low risk of misuse, etc., we would not be going on the record opposing that sale just on the basis that they are guns. Yes, they are guns, but they are presumably going to help catch the bad guys and protect people, you know, who need protection, that sort of thing. But some instances of Canadian exports really have been so egregious in the way that this risk of misuse has been apparent and ignored by the government, apparent to us and many observers, but ignored by the government of Canada. And we feel that there is a trend where when compliance with the law, compliance with human rights, you know, promises, pledges, all of these comes into conflict with profit, and this is an oversimplification, there is a trend that the commercial interests come out winning every single time. And there's more to that. There's also strategic interests, alliances, etc. But at the end of the day, these promises, repeated promises of the Canadian government of increased rigor, increased transparency around the arms trade, are, you know, they sound very nice when they say them. They look very good on paper, but they are not reflected in actual practice. Actual practice thus far leaves a lot to be desired about Canada's commitment to a robust export control system, and the evidence is not soft or, you know, wishy-washy or speculative. You know, there's very hard evidence of instances of misuse, instances of exports that are diverted, instances of rules being broken essentially by the government of Canada. There seems, despite joining the Arms Trade Treaty, we still don't see, and we hope this changes, we still don't see like a genuine desire to change the business as usual attitude around the arms trade. And what is the business as usual attitude around the arms trade? Selling to anyone, to the highest bidder, anyone with deep pockets, with very little regard for human rights violations, very little regard to how the arms are going to be used, and always framing it in terms of, well, we're creating jobs, we're sustaining jobs, we're bringing money into the Canadian economy. which is true
Well,
enough.
those are true.
But
I mean, that is, I wish it were not true, but
no, it
those
is
are
true.
real considerations,
They are, but we feel there are limits to that. I mean, and
Right.
I've many times I've said, if Saudi Arabia, if a country with an abysmal human rights record such as Saudi Arabia is eligible to receive Canadian-made military exports, who would not be? Because they set the bar very, very low. And if you set to sell to a drug cartel, why not? If a certain number of jobs are going to be created, and if money is coming into the Canadian economy, and if you can say, if we don't do it, somebody else would do it. The state of Saudi Arabia has engaged in unequivocally criminal behavior. They have oppressed minorities. They are consistently repressive of women. They brazenly assassinated a journalist, Jamal Khashoggi, with showing no regard for international law and international human rights. And this is all
But
known.
the Yemen thing is the place where I think the most attention is being focused, right? That they
Yes.
are basically at war in Yemen, and are they using Canadian armored personnel carriers there?
Yeah, there are some indications, and Kelsey can also speak to that. There are some indications they have been spotted definitely in the border area and pretty mashed up, like showing evidence of combat. But the reality is that the material support that Canada is providing to Saudi Arabia, I think, can be said to be a contributing factor to the crisis, even if Canadian-made goods are not directly seen or spotted, engaged in the battlefield in Yemen. You're arming the chief instigator of the humanitarian crisis in Yemen. You know that they are misusing weapons. We know for a fact that they have misused French, Italian, American, British weapons. They have been employed for naval.
Okay, now if let's
yeah.
pretend I am the prime minister. Would would Justin Trudeau dispute what you just said? Would he say that no, we don't really think they're doing that, or would he say, well, we have to go ahead and sell them because we already have a contract and it's illegal for us to back out? Or would he say we can't afford to lose those jobs? What am I supposed to say, playing the role of Justin?
Devil's advocate. Well, they have said almost each and every line of argument that you just alluded to, the jobs, the contractual obligations, etc. One thing you didn't mention, and that they have said a lot, is that when they see conclusive evidence of misuse, they might reassess their exports. But that is a misleading notion, because no law, domestic or international, requires conclusive evidence of misuse. The threshold is much lower, and it is mere risk that should prompt the cancellation of exports or the denial of export permit. And the government of Canada itself, it has issued some pretty damning reports of the human rights situation in Saudi Arabia. It recognizes a lot of these patterns of abuse, misuse, repression, executions, all of these things, except it comes to the wrong conclusion. It presents a very scathing statement of this human rights situation in Saudi Arabia and beyond its borders and in Yemen. And then it says, conclusion, we see no reason to suspend the export permits, and the export permits will be reinstated. So it's a one of these day is night, black is white spin where against all evidence, they reach that conclusion. So I mentioned risk, but even this made up higher standard of evidence has been met, and there is documentary evidence. It is not hearsay. It has been on the front page of the Globe and Mail. Stephen Chase, the reporter of the Globe and Mail, has reported on this. And recently, a UN report, in no ambiguous terms, said that countries like Canada, by name, Canada, the UK, Iran, and others were contributing to the perpetuation of the crisis in Yemen.
Well,
so
that ought to be the final word on the matter.
One would think, and taken together, it just paints a picture of a stubborn government. Mm-hmm.
When did this contract start? How did we get into this mess?
Yeah, there's various elements. I mean, this particular contract, the big controversial contract, was announced on Valentine's Day, on February 14th of 2014. We had sold to the Saudis before, but this just the sheer size of this contract made it very newsworthy and catching attention. When it was announced by the trade minister of the time, Minister Ed Fast, there was no mention whatsoever of Saudi Arabia, of the recipient. It was framed as an economic victory for Canada and announced with lots of fanfare and enthusiasm as an economic victory. We have secured the biggest manufacturing deal in Canadian history.
But they didn't say who it was to deal with?
No, or they didn't emphasize it, they didn't emphasize it. But it was all on the jobs that were going to be created or sustained and on the sheer size of this thing. When this became controversial, the Liberals started sort of shooting the ball, or shifting the blame to the Conservatives and saying, well, you know what, we were stuck with this contract. It's something that the Conservatives signed before us, and
shame on them.
Yeah, shame on them. We have no option but to execute it. Soon after that, we learned that that wasn't the full truth. Yes, the Conservatives had negotiated the contract, but the key step for the contract to proceed and be fulfilled is the issuance of export permits. And not a single export permit had been issued under the Conservatives, and all of the export permits thus far have been issued by the Liberals. So
when do the export permits get issued? After the equipment has already been produced?
Well, this is
ready to ship them, or before the contract is negotiated?
Well, this is such a good question, Meta, because it speaks to one of the profound weaknesses of Canada's export control regimes. There is a Crown corporation, which is called the CCC, the Canadian Commercial Corporation, which acts as a prime contractor for many of these contracts. Under the Harper government, a contract whose terms to this day we don't know fully, I mean, we just know maybe some snippets of it, was negotiated to sell up to $15 billion worth of armored vehicles to Saudi Arabia. At that point, the export permits had not been issued. The contract had been negotiated, but the export permits required for it to, the green light, like the ultimate green light is the issuance of the export permits, that had not happened. But the contract had been negotiated. Later, under the Liberal government, it was the time to issue the export permit. By law, these export permits can only be issued after a risk assessment takes place. And that's where the Canadian government assesses whether, there is a risk of misuse or not, whether the export can proceed or not.
Now, hold on. Let me just think about whether that's a good idea or not. If I were going to buy several $1 billion worth of equipment, I would want to know when I sign the contract that for sure you can deliver the darn things.
Right.
Why would you wait until you're ready to ship them and then say, do we want to really sell these or not? That's
a very problematic gap in time and in process between negotiation and the issuance of the export permit. But the consequence of this problematic gap, Meta, is that at the stage of the issuance of export permit, there is very little incentive to conduct a proper risk assessment. Because the contract has already been negotiated.
They've already got the deal. Of course,
they've already got the juicy deal. There may be even penalties written into the contract for non-compliance. So get that, penalties for non-compliance before conducting the risk assessment. Even conducting the risk assessment. So when the risk assessment stage happens, there is a profound disincentive to deny it. How can they deny a 14 billion or 15 billion contract at that stage? And they didn't.
I think Kelsey knows things like how many of these things are being produced and what they are and how they're supposed to. Can I ask about, what's in this contract?
Absolutely, yeah. So the actual product, it's referred to as a light armored vehicle. So although the current government has called them Jeeps before, really this is more akin to a tank. So it's a 6-wheeled tank that is armored. It has different formats, but essentially it is a tank. And one critical detail that Cesar touched upon is we've actually been exporting these light armored vehicles to Saudi Arabia since 1991, right? So for almost 30 years, these LAVs have been going out. And I think this is an important point to make, just as an aside, where we do see a lot of politics being played, right? The conservatives will go after the liberals when the liberals greenlight the permits. The liberals will go after the conservatives for signing the actual contract. But regardless of what political party has been in power at the federal level, we've seen these LAVs exported in massive volumes to Saudi Arabia. The only major difference, well, I guess two, would be the almost comically large value of this 2014 deal, and also the fact that the war in Yemen has occurred. But even aside from the war in Yemen, the government of Canada, and even before becoming a state's party to the ATT, the government of Canada had a litany of reasons not to greenlight these exports. We've seen them also diverted to Bahrain.
But in 91 or whatever, it was not a public issue. Nobody made a big fuss about it. Is that right? When did
I think Project Ploughshares did, but maybe, maybe we were the only ones.
We might have been one of the few, my predecessors and Kelsey's predecessors.
Yeah, I was born in 1991, so I certainly wasn't one of the ones making a stink.
There you go.
But to my understanding, Ploughshares has been writing about this for a long time. But certainly, yeah, the fact that the volume of the deal in 2014 was so large, I mean, that was one of the kind of embers that started the fire, and then also the fact that the war in Yemen has kicked off. So the actual contract itself, the government of Canada is not super keen to release information on it. We've met a lot of stonewalling, and unfortunately, this is something that we've come to grow used to. But the actual contract itself, about 2/3 of the contract is for the actual hardware. So for the actual light armored vehicles.
How many of these things are they? What are the cost a piece? And how are they supposed to be used? I mean, if you were really a responsible country needing one of them, why would you need one? What would you use it for?
I mean, Canada. This is Canada uses many of these vehicles, similar to the ones that we're exporting to the Saudis. The Saudis right now are getting the LAV 6 model. But the Canadian Armed Forces utilizes the LAV 3 model, which is its predecessor. So, I mean, I guess the legitimate use, I mean, I would love to see them for search and rescue, for medical use. They do have medical configurations. It can be outfitted with kind of a clean interior, which some states do use them for that.
A clean interior, you mean something like an ambulance? Or I can't visualize it. This is a thing, a tank in my memory is a thing where these people get inside and they are really surrounded by metal. And,
yes.
and they, such that if a bullet or something comes at them, they can go
They're protected.
They can go through a lot. Okay.
Correct. Yeah.
So you're saying that maybe there are occasions when some kind of ambulance would need that kind of protection, and you could use these things in a benign way in a situation that I can't imagine what, but
yeah. So no, it's the actual vehicle itself becomes an ambulance. So it's usually painted white. It'll have a cross on it. The actual vehicle itself,
so
and it would be for retrieving injured and that sort of thing.
Some places have used them for that.
Yes, yeah. I mean that's and if you watch, if you go to any of the arms fairs, sometimes they'll actually show that. I know that the General Dynamics Land Systems, these LAVs have actually been shown, I believe, in Canadian arms fairs, where they will paint them down the middle. One side is combat, the other side is ambulance. Now, of course, the vast majority of these vehicles are used in combat applications. Arms manufacturers are keen to paint the fact that these could be dual use. I mean, even if it was an ambulance, I don't think that would be dual use under Canadian law. But they're keen to basically say these can be used for benign scenarios. But when it comes to something like an LAV, I mean, that is quite a stretch to say the very least. But to get back to the actual contract itself, yeah. So 2/3 of these. So the number that was originally part of the contract it was 900 and change LAVs. It was almost 1,000 LAVs. There's different individual values. I believe, off the top of my head, I should say, that Project Ploughshares has in the past valued these at about $10 million a piece. Right, so these are, maybe 20
Really?
Ferraris, 10 Ferrari. I don't know how much a Ferrari is, but yes. So they're quite expensive. These are kind of, cutting edge military vehicles, and that's one of the reasons why there is such a market for them, because it's not just Saudi Arabia that utilizes them. A lot of Canadian allies utilize them. The Americans have hundreds of them, and so, but the actual total number of LAVs, as we've learned from just media reporting, has dropped down to about 700 and change. That also might have changed since that was reported, but that's kind of the latest figure.
Sorry, but now, how often do they produce these things? As they come off the assembly line, they immediately get shipped? Or
secrecy has been the operative word throughout this deal, and the funny thing is that every time that they've stonewalled, anything, they say the word transparency. They literally say the word transparency, and they say, that the Canadian arms trade is informed by high standards of rigor and transparency. But it's, for years we have been trying to piece together the story of the Saudi arms deal, and it has been a combination of, from sympathetic, members of parliament or the members of parliament that are also following this file that ask, order paper questions or questions during a question period, or media leaks or media reporting, etc. But very little information has been volunteered by the Canadian government, including your specific question about how many are we selling. This is the CBC at some point had a story and they had perhaps their own leaks, but we don't know. The reality is we know very little about these details.
These are big things. It's hard to see how you can secretly ship them. I mean,
there's pictures.
If binocular stands at the gate of the factory, they're going to see these things being loaded and moved.
And there are pictures and people who have traced literally the route that they would follow, literally from the plant to Saudi Arabia, and how they take different routes. But again, the government is not denying that this is happening. That's like interesting to know what route they follow. But we know this is happening. Now, to your earlier question, and Kelsey made a great point. There's other possible uses for these vehicles, but it's a bit of a stretch. These are latest generation. They pack a heavy punch. These are combat vehicles. And normally a Saudi Arabian National Guard or a military force would not order 900 ambulances. We know these are for fighting. But this is where an important distinction comes in. I was at an event at one point, and somebody who was defending these sales, he says, "So what? Even if they're spotted in Yemen, so what? I mean, what do you think they're going to be used for?" Sort of this logic that because they are military vehicles, they are meant for war. I mean, so almost accusing us of being naive. Like, what else do you think? What other conceivable use do you think a military vehicle would have if not for war? There's also the potential and the verified pattern of illegitimate, illegal use. The United Nations has said, literally the systematic targeting of civilians. We know within the Saudi borders.
So in 2017, and this was actually the original suspension of export permits for LAVs that Ottawa slapped on Saudi Arabia. There was Canadian vehicles, not of the variant of the $14 billion deal, not made by General Dynamics Land Systems Canada in London, Ontario, but another Ontario-based company called Teradyne. And these are likewise armored vehicles, something you'd see in a movie. Much closer to a tank than a Ford, F-150 or whatever it is.
Sorry, are they exactly the same design, or do they each have their own models?
No, they're in the same category of
Yeah.
general, same category, but yeah, like a Ford or a Chevy, they have their own specificities. Yeah.
Yeah, these vehicles would be more likely to be used in events of kind of civil disturbances, usually. But nonetheless, during the Saudi crushing of a popular protest in the eastern provinces of Shiite minorities, there was Canadian vehicles manufactured by this Ontario-based company called Teradyne that were photographed in the region. Um, it later came out that Global Affairs said that there was no, I can't remember exactly what their findings were, but it was something akin to there was no indication that these were used to violate human rights, so on and so forth, even though they were in the area of the protest where we know that protesters were getting crushed by Saudi domestic forces. Additionally, I believe it was in 2012 where Canadian-made LAVs were handed off to Bahrain, a close ally of Saudi Arabia, that were then used in Bahrain to crush internal dissent. So this is all to say that these are more instances that Cesar was alluding to earlier, where there is a clear risk that when we provide these vehicles to Saudi Arabia, that they will be used in these instances of misuse, whether that misuse is diversion to Bahrain, whether that misuse is to the very compelling allegations that they were used to kill civilians in the eastern provinces, or the kind of growing mountain of evidence that they're being used in Yemen, again, which would be an instance of diversion, and which again has a litany of human rights implications.
Yeah. And one sad, the very unfortunate fallout of this matter is that after these allegations surface, Canada promises, we're going to look into this, we're going to conduct a full and thorough investigation. And now, what I find very unfortunate is that for the sake of preserving the deal, they end up validating whatever Saudi claim of propriety Saudi Arabia makes, because the only way Canada can get away with reaching the conclusion that the deal is kosher and can proceed and it's not being misused is by whitewashing the version of events of what really happened, by validating, by believing, and by going on the record that Saudi Arabia's claim that everything was by the book and that everything was proportionate and that any civilian that was killed was an insurgent. All of these broad claims Canada accepts as fact, because if it disputed the Saudi claim, then it would have to, well, maybe there is a risk after all, and maybe we have to stop these exports. And the only way to continue them is by accepting as valid the Saudi explanations. Mm-hmm. In the case of Khashoggi, we know Saudi Arabia lies. When they killed Khashoggi in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, there were like 8 different versions till the truth is sort of, and they still haven't fully owned up to the truth. But the intelligence community of the world, the United Nations Special Rapporteur for Extrajudicial Assassinations, they all have concluded this could not have happened without the blessing of the state of Saudi Arabia at its highest levels. And they lied. And we let this slide, and just for the sake of preserving the arms deal. So that just sets a troubling precedent going forward. And then when other allies or adversaries misbehave, Canada won't have any credibility to criticize them, because we're looking the other way when it comes to Saudi Arabia for the sake of preserving the arms deal. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, Meta, this is a story of arms controls not working. At the end of the day, I mean, they are not working the way they should.
We now belong to the Arms Trade Treaty. Mm-hmm. Now that's an international treaty. Presumably, the reason Canada dragged its feet in joining or signing it was that we didn't want to have this embarrassing situation to acknowledge and to clean up. But every treaty should have some means of verification and of enforcement, mm-hmm. and some penalties for infraction and that sort of thing. What is our situation vis-a-vis the Arms Trade Treaty?
There is no enforcement mechanism for the Arms Trade Treaty. That's the long and the short of it. So we're facing in a situation where instances of non-compliance are a matter of accusation and hearsay and denials, but there is no final or ultimate arbiter of non-compliance. This final authority that determines Canada was non-compliant. The UK, for instance, there is no doubt in my mind and my heart that the UK, for instance, has been blatantly not compliant with the Arms Trade Treaty. But if you ask them, they'll say, no, actually, we have been complying. And that's the end of the conversation. Really, that's the end of the conversation.
Boy.
Unless other countries care enough about that instance of non-compliance to call them out or to impose sanctions or to fight them or what have you. But there is really no mechanism. Funny enough, where there is clarity in the Arms Trade Treaty regime on matters of arrears, has this country paid their dues? Have this country paid their assessed contribution? Have they submitted the report they were supposed to submit by whatever date? On that, there is clarity, okay? The X country or Y country or Z country is not being compliant because they didn't submit the report by May 31st. But on questions of implementation of actual export permits, denials, or arms transfers, there is no clear determination of compliance. They'll say,
this very sad situation. Why didn't I know that, for one thing?
No, because think about it. You've heard this.
If you have a treaty and there is, it's just a declaration, then what's it worth? I mean, why wasn't it set up in such a way as to do something?
Yes, and there are treaty skeptics. I will tell you that we're fans of the treaty, but there are treaty skeptics who are like us, are advocating for a more regulated arms trade, etc., but are no fans of the treaty because they feel they give cover to countries such as the UK. They feel that countries that are not ready to change their business as usual attitude are going to continue their practices, but join the treaty just for show. It gives them this appearance of being a good international citizen, a responsible actor, etc., and say, we believe in multilateralism. How so? Here's the evidence. We joined the Arms Trade Treaty, but their actual practice does not change one iota.
If some countries got together and called them out, what kinds of things could actually be done if some countries decided that we needed to have a little bit more rigor in enforcement?
Yeah.
What kinds of, or even public opinion, maybe shaming, the ICANN treaty, now the the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons,
right,
based on the notion that you can just shame countries into compliance eventually.
It's an uphill struggle, but look at the Security Council. I mean, which is a sad indictment on the state of affairs. Security Council, both on the nuclear file, but also on the conventional arms trade file. This is a body that is supposed to be tasked with the maintenance of international security, and they are the culprits, the main culprits in the conventional arms trade and in the nuclear threat. So for the smaller states to push them to compliance is an uphill struggle. When the strong and the powerful of the world want change, or they want Iran to do this, or they want this country to do this, they mean it. I mean, they know how to pressure. They will promise to economic sanctions and military activity if you don't comply. And there's very strong pressure. When it's the other way around, when it's the weak, small nations pressuring the strong, all we have is strongly worded statements, appeals to public conscience, appeals to public opinion, hopes that the converted teenagers will eventually care about government and be elected, and that 2 generations from now maybe we'll have this gradual view of change. And that's admittedly a very gloomy view of things, and there's many other options. But in terms of taking them on, look at the nuclear ban treaty. There's the normative power of the majority, that sort of thing. But at the end of the day, states with nuclear weapons will disarm if and when they so choose. Well, that decision will be influenced by pressure, but it will be their decision. That will be they will not be compelled externally.
Okay,
to make.
I'm willing to say that there are no intrinsically evil persons in Ottawa, that they are reacting to their interpretation of some realities.
Hmm.
And I presume that one of the realities that they're taking account of is that they would lose political votes if they if they lost too many jobs. And that
Yes.
probably the job incentive is one of the main factors that they are responding to, even though
Hmm.
whether or not they acknowledge it. Probably they even do acknowledge it. I don't
Yeah.
know. So, Kelsey, how many jobs are at stake, and what alternatives might there be? Uh, these things are made, I believe, in some place like Sarnia, Ontario. Is that where the
London.
fact? London, Ontario.
London. That's where
Oh,
the General
mhm.
Dynamics Land Systems
Okay.
manufacturing facility is
And
located.
do they manufacture anything else there? could these could they transfer the the equipment to making something, I don't know, something that would really be useful for, changing to a green economy of some kind of.
I mean, in terms of how long it would take to switch over, I'm not an economist. I couldn't speak to that, or an engineer certainly, or whatever you would need, whatever trade you would need to be to understand that. But kind of the facts on the ground, from our understanding, there's about 2,000 people that work at General Dynamics Land Systems Canada, right? And the jobs angle is something that we take seriously, right? As a human rights organization, labor rights is a part of that, and we certainly don't want anyone, left on the down and out because an arms deal went awry. Um, but there's kind of two broad things that I'd say. If the government of Canada was really serious about protecting these jobs, then they would not enter into these arms deals in the first place, right? The government of Canada understands its own arms control obligations even prior to the ATT, and under the EIPA, which is the Export and Import Permits Act, which is our domestic legislation. If we were going to export to a country like Saudi Arabia and it would come to the understanding of Global Affairs Canada that these weapons were being misused, even prior to becoming a states party to the ATT, Canada would have been obligated and was obligated to cease the export of these weapon systems, right? So, in our opinion, it's actually quite irresponsible for Canada to go out and to facilitate these arms deals, because when inevitably we find out a country like Saudi Arabia is misusing these weapons, Global Affairs Canada is obligated to stem the arms deals, which of course would have a blowback effect on the jobs in those manufacturers. So really, I mean, Canada should look at this in the long run, and I know that Ploughshares actually has made this argument for years. It's actually, there should be financial disincentives to rely on serial human rights abusers for jobs, and I think that the actual production facilities, these companies, should factor that into their thinking as well, because they also understand how Canada's arms control regime works, because they have to read up on it, right? They have to go and apply for these export permits. So I would also argue it's financially irresponsible for these arms manufacturers to get tied up into these deals when there is such a risk that down the road, when again inevitably these countries misuse the weapons, there's an obligation for Global Affairs to stem these exports.
Okay, I think let's take it as, let's stipulate that we all agree, and even I
Sure.
would assume that most of the Canadian public would agree that it's irresponsible to have done what was done. Now the question is, how do we get out of it? What's the most promising
Right.
way to combat this problem or to make a transition? If we can think of a way of, the image of Ploughshares is beating your swords
Sure.
into plowshares.
Hmm.
What can you beat an LAV into that might be nice and green?
Right.
So
A plow, or
Yeah, yeah.
you don't
An
even plow
ambulance.
anymore. That's not a good thing to do anymore. Plowing the soil. So what do we want to create that
Sure.
could be the future?
Sure. Yes. So, I mean, prior to General Dynamics being General Dynamics in London, it was General Motors, and General Motors actually made train cars. right? And it's
Rainfalls.
not discussed a lot, but yeah, I mean, that's what they used to make, right? So we've seen before, an example that I've written about and Ploughshares has talked about before is the economic conversion away from the manufacture of weapons that we saw during World War II. A lot of companies that had to convert their production facilities to make bombs and that sort of thing, there afterwards successfully converted back to what we would deem to be socially beneficial things, which now today might be, green energy is always the
Well, I
the
like
example that's
trains.
given. Looking at exactly what should be made in the production facility, again, I think we're the wrong people to ask. We that is not our expertise. Our specialty is in Canada's arms controls, and unfortunately, Canada has to stop this deal. At the end of the day, whether or not it affects jobs, Canada's obligations domestically and
Okay,
internationally are very
but
clear.
Canada is going to have to, bite the bullet. If I don't like the metaphor,
Hmm.
but actually lose some jobs, and there will be a
Yes.
political implication for that. And
Sure,
I
and I
think
mean,
we ought to think seriously about what do you do to mitigate the outcome.
sure.
Right.
Okay.
And we're the first ones in line to agree with you again,
Yeah.
right?
I mean,
Absolutely.
yeah.
And again, like I will say, we're not economists, but there have been examples. One example that I've thought of before was, and I'm not sure how successful it was, but the economic diversification plan that was levied to Asbestos Ontario, right? When the town started moving, the town of Asbestos, I guess it's in Quebec. Both federal and provincial funding that was poured into the town to diversify the town away from producing asbestos, which of course is a socially destructive venture, like much mining is. And if there was a similar way to approach, these massive these arms producers to diversify away from relying on exporting billions of dollars to serial human rights abusers, I think that should be an avenue that's pursued.
Meta, you said something. Sorry to jump in. That I found very interesting, Meta. And you said that we're assuming, and I agree with that assumption, that folks in Ottawa are not, evil folks, intrinsically evil, and I believe that. I don't think anyone in Ottawa is like, interested in indirectly or directly contributing to killed children and killed women and maim civilians, which is what's happening, whether or not they intended. That's exactly the impact. I don't think that's it. I think they how do they go to bed at night sort of question. I think they say on the whole, on the balance of factors, this is good for Canada. I think that's the ultimately their rationalization. What we're trying to say is on the whole, this is not good for Canada. And we cannot be so short term about it. On the whole, this is not good for Canada. This is not good for the world Canada wants to create. This is a question not just about London, Ontario. This is a question about Canada's role in the world and how we're pulling our weight and what the sort of impact we're having in international relations, in security relations, and in the excessive accumulation of weapons. When one talks about the Middle East, Saudi, all of these things, people often point to the number of killed civilians, the number of air raids, etc. There's a bigger destabilization happening, and there's an excessive accumulation of weapons happening that it's a kettle, like it's sooner or later
in the big term, from God's eyes for sure, where it's not good for Canada. It's not good for the people working on this equipment. It's not a good job.
Right.
But
it's certainly not good for the Saudi civilians at the other end of and the Yemeni civilians. Yeah.
But we have to look at if they actually get laid off, what are they going to do? We have to think in terms of really the plan.
Yeah, no, I think that's a pragmatic way to look at it. But in the interim, I still have a problem with sustaining the narrative that Canada places a premium on human rights and we do everything right and we're these righteous players. Because if there is a gap between rhetoric and action, one of the two has to change. You either change the action, you stop exporting, or you change the rhetoric, you stop saying that you have some of the strong export controls in the world. Maybe you say, well, we have sometimes adequate export controls. And you know, but it's a duality. At the same time as Canada is grandstanding about its virtues, its values, its protection of human rights, its commitment, it is harming one of the irredeemable worst human rights violators in the world. So it is that tension that is not tenable, I think, in the long term. And we're in COVID, and we haven't mentioned COVID. Just to wrap up that thought, Meta, we haven't mentioned COVID in this conversation, surprisingly. Well, it wasn't really about COVID, but in the context of COVID, we are hearing, this talk about a new world or a post-COVID world, or what's going to happen. And I think we really need to think about Canada's role in the world. We just months ago we lost a bid to the UN Security Council, which was the signature foreign policy project of the Trudeau government. It was a failure. We didn't get it, and I'm not sure we've had enough soul searching or introspection to say, well, why? I mean, there are reasons for that. And there is that. Canada endorsed a ceasefire in the context of COVID, following an appeal by the UN Security General, and we made a big deal of having endorsed it, but at the same time we're doing these things. So it's these policy contradictions that I think are untenable, and people are starting to realize, not just in Canada, but internationally.
Okay, I'm myself in total agreement with you that to a new extent, I'm thinking that political problems more and more, at least in this particular historical moment, reflect a real moral issue, that they're not just practical, but it's not just Canada either. It's the state of the world in general is one in which I think there's a huge reflection of concerns that are not based on human values at all, and that what we need is a good, revival meeting or some.
Well, I think leadership or leadership. Leadership, political leadership. Even the question you asked Kelsey earlier about what changes, in terms of economic conversion, which is a very valid question and a great answer. But before that, you need the political decision, to go in that direction.
And
you can have the best laid plans for conversion, etc., but you need the political decision. Like, what does it mean? It means less profit. It means denied export permits. It means contracts that we could have, but we're not having, and China is getting, and some other, and that's what it means.
Yeah.
If you're really going to take it seriously, and I'm not sure we're there.
No, I'm afraid not. Besides the Saudis, Canada has sold weapons to other countries. And more recently, I think there's been an issue about selling weapons to Turkey. And Turkey itself has gone through a very sad transition from what looked like a promising democracy 10 years or so ago to a situation where Erdogan is leading a pan-Muslim something coalition of some kind. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the sales of weapons to Turkey.
The fact that the exports to Saudi Arabia are so historically significant just in their value, rightfully so, there's a lot of attention on it. But I think it also, just because, there's only so much attention to go around, honestly, it has the effect of kind of obfuscating all of the other, or most of the other negative aspects of Canadian arms trade. Certainly not all of them, but many of them. And certainly here I'm talking about kind of media interest and that sort of thing. But yeah, in the past few years, exports to Turkey have increased, Canadian military exports, and they've also increased alongside Turkey's kind of growing belligerence in the Middle East, right? So in the past few years, Turkey has not only been fighting an insurgency in its southeast, but it's also invaded Syria, invaded Iraq, invaded Libya, and has more recently provided weapons to its ally Azerbaijan for use in Nagorno-Karabakh. The majority of, and we released a report on this, I should mention, last month, called Killer Optics, that got a significant amount of media attention. But the majority of these weapons are produced by a company called L3 Harris Westcam in Burlington, Ontario.
Say it again.
L3 Harris Westcam, more colloquially known as Westcam. And they make targeting sensors. They're essentially cameras, and they're traditionally fitted to the bottom of aircraft and increasingly so drones. Turkey has used these sensors to surveil and identify targets and to launch smart munitions against targets in all of these conflict zones. And unfortunately, recently we've heard the Canadian government say they're just cameras, but really these sensors are integral for Turkey's ability to conduct modern airstrikes, which have been tied to very serious allegations of human rights violations. More recently, when the allegations arose that I should say that have now been proven correct, allegations arose that these sensors were being diverted to the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh, fitted to Turkish drones. In a positive move, we saw Global Affairs Canada actually suspend these export permits to Turkey, which again is positive. We welcome the news. However, we remain vigilant because in the last few years, Canada's track record for pausing these permits and then pulling off an investigation and then reinstating them once the dust kind of settles, that's the route that they've gone twice now with Saudi Arabia since 2016 or 2017 rather. Yeah, I mean Turkey really has jumped up to be kind of it was actually the fourth biggest recipient of Canadian weapons last year. It was about $150 million. The year before it was about 100 million. The year before that it was 75 or so. So certainly not in the realm of
numbers. Even you say that's a small amount. I mean, I think of that's a huge amount from my point
absolutely.
Of view.
Yeah,
but
Saudi's in the billions, so maybe relative to that,
relatively. But when you said, what'd you say, 50 billion for the Saudis? Was that what you mentioned?
15
billion dollars. Oh boy, you can buy a whole lot of food and medicine and teachers and stuff for that price.
Absolutely.
Oh boy, and
so even last year, looking at the value of Turkish exports, $150 million. This is a huge amount, and for instance, that is several times, several tens of millions of dollars greater than exports to the United Kingdom, which the UK has been kind of a stalwart consumer of Canadian weapons and has been intrinsically tied in with the Canadian arms trade. So to even see, I mean, forget about Saudi Arabia for a sec, right? We see countries like Turkey edging out traditional Canadian consumers of weapons. We also see countries like the UAE, right? The UAE, if memory serves, the UAE is in the top 10 for last year, and the UAE, if memory serves, also outtrended France, which again is a traditional consumer of Canadian weapons.
We're talking about how much stuff and what kinds of goods. Or bags.
Well, Meta, you're really quizzing me right now. Yeah. I can't remember the exact amount, but we're talking about probably for the UAE, it was probably in the pond of $50 million or so. The UAE is a big consumer also of Canadian light armored vehicles. So not so much the LAVs made in London, Ontario, but other LAVs. Made around Ontario, as well as things like machine guns that are attached to them. But I mean, it's kind of a hodgepodge of things, but certainly not things that we would want to see in Emirati hands. Just because they likewise also have a poor track record of misusing them. This is all to say that we are seeing once again, I use the term serial human rights abusers outtrending the traditional consumers of Canadian weapons. And although I think broadly I can speak for myself, I'm not a fan of seeing, billions of dollars of Canadian weapons go anywhere, but to see them go to places where we have good reason to believe that they will be misused reflects quite poorly on the health of Canada's arms control regime.
Well, I would have problems, I would always want to question the use anyway, even if you say to legitimate governments and so on, because for example, in the U.S., there's been this trend to use military equipment to suppress civil arrest of any kind.
Yeah, no, that's
arm the police with military equipment. I think
that's a problematic trend in itself, and the militarization of police forces. But just on the Kelsey mentioned the top 10, and UAE is there, and Turkey and Belgium, and that's another story linked to Saudi that a lot of detail. But the takeaway is that at this point, I think a very troubling proportion of Canada's arms trade is linked to conflict. To the perpetuation of conflict in the world, to the very things that we lament in the West when we see in the TV screens, and that's the where I say the dot connecting abilities of the West have left a lot to be desired. These weapons to Saudi Arabia, it still seems recent. The Arab Spring, just a few years ago, these democratic pushes in certain countries, and the harsh sort of response by their governments. I believe democratic pressures will erupt in Saudi Arabia sooner or later. Mark my words. I don't think it's natural there, for an oppressive regime to exist in perpetuity. I think democratic pressure, especially now with the advent of social media and knowing what democracy looks like, all of these things, they will erupt. When they do, the response of the Saudi government will be heavy-handed, and it will involve Canadian-made armored vehicles, And when we're looking at that on the screen in Canada, from our bed or our lazy boy, we're going, how did that happen? How could that happen? As if there wasn't a clear linkage to the West providing weapons to these conflict zones. The conflict, be it in Asia, in Latin America, in Africa, or in the Middle East, the countries most heavily involved in conflict are not traditionally weapons producers. These are weapons that are flowing from the West to conflict zones. And these are companies that need to sustain the bottom line. These arms manufacturers need to place on the market year after year billions of weaponry. But that is a problematic situation, even in the context of jobs and economic benefits for the country that is doing the exporting.
So your role is to remind people of where we're headed and what we're
Indeed.
up to, and remind us of how we should pull up our socks and get a little bit of morality back,
Yeah, and
Just
we
plain
admit
ethics.
there is a cost. I'll be the first to admit there is a cost to complying with norms.
Besides Project Ploughshares, there are some conscientious economists who are also thinking about how to make a transition from producing things that are a detriment to humankind to producing things that are beneficial to us all.
Absolutely.
And we need both sides. We need to be thinking of our values and our responsibilities as human beings, and also of how we're going to make a living. And so bless you both.
Thank you,
Carry
Mary.
on. It's really
This conversation is one of the weekly series Talk About Saving the World, produced by Peace Magazine and Project Save the World. Please visit our website at tosavetheworld.ca, where you can sign the Platform for Survival, a list of 25 public policy proposals that, if enacted, would greatly reduce the risk of 6 global threats to humankind. Come back next week for another discussion of a serious global issue.